A severed head can remain conscious for up to 30 seconds. The final moments are not always silence and light. They are a theater of agony, of twitching eyes and clenched jaws of lips still moving through prayers, never finished. And in that window, half a minute suspended above death, what memories claw to the surface? For Thomas Cromwell, once the king's blade and shield, it was not the executioner who terrified him. It was the waiting. The world remembers him as a villain or a genius, a butcher in velvet gloves. The low-born blacksmith's son who rose to eclipse the old nobility reshaped the English church and bled power from the Pope into Henry's fat fingers. But the man in the tower, the man now was cold, shivering wet with urine, and forgotten. Once the voice behind the throne, now a condemned breath curling invisible against the damp stone. If you enjoy immersive history, told with depth and detail like this video, and subscribe for more. The Tower of London had a way of listening. Its walls had soaked centuries of last words and false confessions. Beneath their gray, sweating skin, blood clotted in the cracks like old paint. Cromwell had passed these walls countless times when others occupied its cells. Now he walked in circles like they had, though, slower with more rot in the joints, more disbelief in the bones. He remembered the screaming echo of Anne Boleyn's last prayer. He had heard it only once and had buried it deep. But here now it rose. The scream wasn't loud. It was wrong. That was what haunted. It was clipped, rehearsed, compressed into something the headsman could bear. The headsman. Cromwell wondered who would take him. Would it be the same man who had cut through Anne's slender neck with a French sword, or the one who fumbled Moore's spine and needed 2 strokes to finish him? He had not asked. Pride still squatted in the corners of his ruined soul, smoking quietly. 3 weeks had passed since his arrest. Or was it 4? He could not mark days properly, only darkness, and less darkness, punctuated by the shuffle of boots and the clank of a tray. Water tasted of iron. Bread tasted of nothing. He avoided the meat. The betrayal had not come with fanfare. There were no storm clouds, no battle cries. Just a hand on his shoulder at a Privy Council meeting. A nod. A whisper. As though his downfall had always been part of the decor, nestled discreetly between tapestry and torch. The Duke of Norfolk had smirked, but Suffolk had looked away. Cowards. Now alone, Cromwell pressed his ear to the stone wall. Not to listen for ghosts, he was too intelligent for superstition, but for breathing. Human breathing. Something real warm, flawed. He heard none. Just rats. The occasional thud of a body dropped somewhere too far below, and once a child's laugh. That unnerved him more than anything. He sat on the low-cot splinters, digging through the worn linen of his hose. His knees ached. His right eye twitched. A fever had started in his fingers, a trembling that climbed knuckle by knuckle like ivy. He had tried to stop it gripping the wall, clenching his fists, but the shaking was part of him now. It would die with him. A single letter had come unsigned, its seal black wax imprinted with the Tudor rose and nothing else. Inside, 7 words. His Majesty regrets the necessity. God keep you. Not a promise, not even a command, just a polite dismissal. The man who had made him England's vice-regent would not see him again. There would be no audience, no confrontation, only absence. The torches outside his cell guttered more violently that evening. Wind hissed through the cracks like a whispering jury. Cromwell paced twice, then sat again faster. Movement was the only resistance he had left. He coughed once and tasted copper. The blood ran down his chin in a thread drying sticky. He touched his own face gently, not in vanity, but in farewell. The skin was sagging, beard uneven, gums swollen. He had not seen a mirror in weeks. Perhaps that was mercy. He remembered his portrait, Holbein's brutal brushwork, Those pig-dark eyes, the massive hands. Men had trembled before that canvas. Now that image no longer existed in flesh. He spoke aloud to no one. "If the king does not summon me by Sunday, I will know." His voice cracked, but he did not flinch. "He will not summon me." The walls made no reply. That night he dreamed not of his death, but of his beginnings. A boy with ash on his sleeves, a father's fists, a furnace's heat, and always the smell of something burning wool, sometimes flesh. In the dream his mother turned to him, but had no face, only a skull wrapped in linen. He woke with wet cheeks and an ache in his chest, a deeper ache than fear. It was the ache of something forgotten by God, something waiting too long. A guard passed by just before dawn. Cromwell rose, spoke gently as His Majesty written. The man did not stop, did not look. Cromwell lowered himself slowly, bones grinding like old hinges. He whispered as if to the damp, "He loved me once." From above through the window slats high on the tower wall, a crow landed. It croaked once, croaked again, then flew. The light was gray and hard. It did not warm. They were seated beneath a painted ceiling where angels held up the sky. The air in the chamber was perfumed with rose oil and mold, the sweet-sick mingling that always clung to power. Silk rustled more than voices. And when Henry VIII finally turned his great head to speak, it was not rage that fell upon Thomas Cromwell. It was disappointment. "You presume too far," Thomas, the king murmured. No storm, no roar, just 7 words, quiet as a priest's whisper at the deathbed. That was how Cromwell's son broke not with fire, but frost. He had stood beside this king through plague and heresy, queens rising and heads falling, had rewritten the order of England in this man's name. Now here he could not understand the look on Henry's face. "You presume too far." In those syllables, silk-thin, dagger-sharp, Cromwell's heart clenched. He tried to answer, to explain, to kneel and laugh and beg all at once, but his breath caught mid-throat. The courtiers in the room, Norfolk oddly writhelessly, shifted their weight like dogs sniffing blood. They knew the moment, smelled it. Henry's jowled face did not soften. He gestured vaguely, and the guards closed in. "My Lord Cromwell," whispered. A pause. "Not anymore," the king said. "Not anymore." The syllables echoed through Cromwell's body like a hammer to iron. His knees didn't buckle immediately. They stayed locked, shocked. Then the breath left him. Then the sword hand gripped his arm, the ceremonial grasp of arrest. His fingers twitched. No struggle, no words, just the feel of silk robes brushing past him, already stepping into his absence. The throne room faded. What remained was the cold. As they led him through the winding corridors of Whitehall past tapestries he'd commissioned and stairs he had designed, Cromwell's mind broke its leash. Images flooded him, not of guilt, not yet, but of proof. The deeds signed, the abbots hanged, the Spanish envoy turned, the queen divorced, the queen married, the queen executed, the king remarried, all by his hand, all for him. Did Henry not see it? He stumbled on a step. The guard did not slow. Outside a storm threatened, not of weather, of court. Every man who had smiled at Cromwell that month would now sharpen knives behind velvet smiles. Norfolk would be giddy. The old nobility would feast on this fall like wolves chewing marrow. In the tower's outer court, the sky opened not with rain, but with shouts. A crowd had gathered already, word spreading like disease. Traitor, one voice cried, another papist spy, and then laughter, harsh, cruel. No chant of his name, no pity, only cold justice from strangers who knew only what they were told. He had told them what to know. That irony bit deepest. Inside the tower, as the door closed behind him, Cromwell felt not imprisoned, but hollowed, as though his name had been ripped from him. His flesh still pulsed, his hands still sweated, but something incorporeal, something fundamental had already been executed. He waited hours before the charge came. It was not signed by Henry. It bore the seal of the Privy Council, conspiring with enemies abroad, heretical leanings, treason in speech and doctrine, abuse of office. The clerk read the list without emphasis. He might have been tallying grain. Cromwell said only, "Where is the king's letter?" The clerk looked up, hesitated, then answered as if quoting something he had been taught. His Majesty regrets the necessity. That night, Cromwell lay on the stone bench of his first cell and stared into blackness. His head swam with the king's voice, the ghost of that whisper you presume too far. Too far? Was it Anne of Cleves he had arranged the match? Yes, and the king had recoiled from her in bed. But had Cromwell forced the marriage? Hadn't he merely obeyed? Or was it too many enemies crushed? Too many titles claimed he had been named Earl of Essex, not 2 months before. His robes were still being sewn. He remembered Henry's hand, once clasped over his own, blood-warm and heavy, after the Northern Rebellion was quashed. "You are our most faithful servant," the king had said then. "We are one mind." Was that lie? Or was this sleep came not in peace, but in jolts? He awoke with sweat on his back, dreaming of being dragged naked through mud. Each time the same whisper in the dream presumed, as if the word were a crime unto itself. Morning brought more silence. No message from the king, no advocate. Only Norfolk grinning at the cell door like a wolf in ermine. "I knew you'd overreach the Duke," said softly gloating, "but I did not know you'd fall so far so fast." Cromwell smiled, then tight-lipped, bloodless. "Be careful, your grace," he said. "The king's love moves quickly." Norfolk spat, once missing his boot, then left. The door closed with a sound like finality. Later, alone again, Cromwell wrote a letter to Henry. 1 page. No plea, only explanation. A servant's dignity inked in trembling lines. He held it up to the torchlight. The words looked foreign. He reread them thrice, then folded the page, slipped it into the hand of the next guard to pass. "Give this to His Majesty, from the man who built his crown's shadow." The guard did not nod, did not even blink. Days passed. The letter was never answered. It was not called a trial, not officially. It was a bill of attainder cleaner, faster, more useful. Justice, when whispered through Parliament's lips, needed no defendant. Only the shape of a man drawn in absence. No witnesses for him, no audience of his peers. Just names, recited accusations inked in black across the face of power. His name carved in ink gilt, presumed like breath. Still they made a show of it, for the sake of propriety, for the comfort of the crown. In the grand chamber of Westminster, where oil lamps bled gold across stone and velvet, they summoned the ghost of Thomas Cromwell. His body arrived in chains, his hair matted with sleep sweat and lice, his shoes muddied from Tower damp. But the man himself, the voice, the mind, the will, was already disassembled. He was not allowed to speak. The clerk of the house read out his crimes, each syllable a slash. The list was theatrical in its breadth. He had betrayed the king to German princes. He had polluted the English court with heresy. He had enriched himself from monastic ruins. He had plotted to usurp royal favor. One claimed he had laughed privately at Henry's infirmities. Another, that he had mocked the Queen's breath. Mocked her breath. Cromwell sat silent. He watched the men. Norfolk smiling beneath his fox fur collar. Gardner eyes downcast, but lips tight with purpose. Suffolk pale. Fitzwilliam red-cheeked with discomfort. All once friends. All now surgeons performing a royal lobotomy. His body shifted on the wooden bench, and the chains clinked a noise too alive for that room. For a moment all eyes turned to him. He met no gaze. He could not. Their stares were surgical, probing, slicing. Behind him, servants whispered and giggled. One of them had wet his tunic with wine before the proceedings, accidentally or not. Cromwell had not wiped it off. Let them see the stain, dark and sticky, like the guilt they painted on him. An actor spoke in his place, Sir Richard Rich, the slime-tongued chancellor, once his creature, now his executioner. Rich gave testimony eyes wide with rehearsed innocence, describing secrets Cromwell had supposedly confessed in shadowed corridors, that the king was old and foolish, that the German alliance must replace Rome, that England was ready for a new sovereign. All lies. Elegant ones. Cromwell tried not to breathe too loudly. He stared instead at the rafters overhead, at the speckled pattern of soot from old torches. Once he had arranged the logistics of this room, the tapestries rotated for seasonal temperature, the seating adjusted to flatter egos. Now he sat where accused witches once had. When a name Catherine Howard was spoken, a tremor entered his chest. Of course. She was Norfolk's niece. The Virgin rose. The soft-skinned child whispered into Henry's loneliness. Cromwell's failed match with Anne of Cleves had cleared the stage for her. The Queen's breath. He understood now. His downfall was not treason, but inconvenience. He was too clever, too ambitious, too loud. And no man was allowed to know the king's secrets better than the king himself. Still he burned to speak. Just once. To say I was your voice. I was your war. Your reformation is built on my bones. But silence was forced. His lips moved once, and the guards gripped their hilts. That was warning enough. When the vote was called, no one objected. Thomas Cromwell, Earl of Essex, and Lord Chancellor Vicegerent in spirituals, was declared traitor. The word had no weight. It floated above him light as parchment. As he was led from the chamber, someone, a boy, perhaps a page, dropped an ink pot. It shattered. Black spattered across the stone floor. The stain looked like blood. The echo of the glass rang longer than the judgment. Back in his cell, Cromwell laughed once. It bubbled up from somewhere dry scraping. He whispered aloud. They let More speak. More, his old enemy. The man he'd watched, Die-Eye's calm hands folded. They'd granted him a final defense at least. Even Anne had spoken on the scaffold. Cromwell would get neither. Just an echo. He touched the wall, felt the chill behind the stone, the seepage of old voices. What would his echo be? What version of him would remain when they wiped his portrait from the walls? His coat of arms from the windows. He stood and looked to the narrow slit of light carved into the tower wall. Through it, a single shaft of dusty sunlight pierced the dark. It landed on a nail jutting from the wood of his bench, rusted bent, nearly broken. He stared at that nail for hours. Later that night, a rat crept along the edge of his blanket. Cromwell did not flinch. It sniffed at his feet, gnawed briefly at the sole of his boot, then retreated into the shadows. Perhaps it sensed death drawing closer. Perhaps it mistook him for already gone. Cromwell did not sleep. He did not move. He simply sat in the pose of a man, listening for something that had already passed. The trial had not needed his voice. The verdict was written before his name. And when dawn came soft and gray and wet with cloud, the cell did not brighten. It merely became less dark. The ceiling dripped. That was the first rhythm of the day. Always. The slow weep of condensation through stone forming one perfect droplet at a time on the blackened iron ring above his bedpost. Then the fall, soft but distinct. It struck the floor like punctuation. He counted them now. It was his clock. 27 drips from midnight to dawn. Thomas Cromwell no longer wrote. The paper was gone. Quills denied. Ink forbidden. The king had erased his voice first in court, and now in the world. Even his own thoughts began to rot, slowed by fever, thick with images more visceral than logical. He saw fingers, slender ones, a bishop's, broken in the rack reversed into claws. He had signed the warrant. The bishop had confessed. It had been necessary. Now in the tower's stink, that word rang false. "Necessary," he whispered aloud. The stone swallowed the sound. Cromwell pressed his forehead to the wall until the cold seeped in behind the eyes. He could feel them vibrating sometimes, his eyes, like something deep within wanted to escape. The guards fed him less now. The bread crumbled in his hand. No wine, just brackish water with a skin of scum. He drank it anyway. His gums bled. At night, the ghosts came, not as shapes, but in smells and sounds. Anne Boleyn's perfume, lemon balm, and fear. It crept down the hallway like smoke. He once approved her scent purchases himself nothing French, he had said. Something modest English. Once, while drifting between sleep and sickness, he heard her voice, light mocking. You chose Henry over God Thomas, and then Henry chose no one. He tried to laugh, but it came out a wet cough. Spittle hit the stone. Pink. He wiped it with his sleeve and said nothing more. His mind turned inward again and again to the string of names that had fallen before him. Fisher, Moore, Anne, the Carthusians, all signed, all sent by him to the block. He had convinced himself then it was governance. That cruelty, when cloaked in legality, ceased to be sin. He saw them now lining the corridor outside his door. They didn't speak, just waited. Heads tilted, not in judgment, but in recognition. The headsman had visited. Cromwell heard the boots, the weight, the silence around him. One guard had whispered the name of the man to the other Calloway, a thick-set Welshman with a reputation for efficiency, the same one who'd taken Margaret Pole, the same who'd needed 5 strokes to finish her. That had been a mercy, too. He dreamt that night of a sword balanced over his head like a crown, made of iron rusted and cracked at the hilt, but impossibly sharp at its edge. The crown did not rest. It hovered humming, and each time he blinked it dropped an inch, then stopped. By morning he awoke with blood on his temples. His fingernails had clawed into his scalp in sleep. He didn't feel it. The guard at the door said nothing as he passed a new robe through the bars. It was gray, lined in linen, soft enough to absorb blood without immediate stain. He recognized the type. Execution garment. Cromwell laid it on the bench and stared at it as if it might speak. It didn't. He thought of Gregory, his son, somewhere out in the country, still untouched by the blow. He had tried to write him weeks ago before they took away quills. The letter was brief. Be better than me. Do not rise too high. He didn't know if it had been sent. Now he wished he'd written more, or nothing at all. That morning he was allowed a priest. The man was young, pimples beneath his cowl, voice trembling. My lord, I am not your lord, Cromwell interrupted. The priest paused. I come to prepare your soul. Cromwell looked at him without blinking. Whose words do you bring, the king's or God's? The boy said nothing. Cromwell exhaled. Then let us speak honestly, he said. I do not repent my life. I only regret my loyalty. The priest flinched. Cromwell did not apologize. Instead, he reached for the priest's hand and gripped it gently, but firmly. When the blade comes, he said, tell me. I want to see it. The priest hesitated, then nodded. Outside, the air was changing. The sound of scaffold work, the hammering of nails, the grinding of wood filtered through the tower, like a heartbeat. They were building his end. He imagined the boards, the rope, the sand bucket. He had organized such scenes himself in cleaner days. Now, he was the stage. He pressed his forehead again to the wall. It was colder now, or maybe he was. Somewhere above him, a crow landed. It cawed. Then another. Cromwell whispered to the stone, the king promised mercy. The crows laughed. The tower is alive. He knows this now. It breathes in mildew and exhales dread. The walls have veins faint and wet twitching beneath the mossy mortar. They pulse with a rhythm not his own. When he lies still when the fever takes him down far enough, he can hear them hum. Cromwell no longer knows how many days remain, or past, or if any still unfold. Time is a luxury of the uncondemned. He drifts in and out of consciousness, moored loosely to his body, like a dying dog tethered by thread. He cannot feel his right foot anymore. His left is swollen. But it doesn't matter, he is always inside the room, even when he's not. The visions began as shadows. First a streak of black across the floor when no one walked past. Then clearer things. Anne came first, not the smiling, witty queen of her French days. This Anne was headless, her spine a stalk of glass. She moved without feet, slid across the flagstones in silence, trailing blood that dripped upward. Cromwell looked down at his boots, and there it was again, her blood dried in brown petals across the leather. "You cleaned it," she whispered, standing at the door. "But it's always there." He tried to speak, to explain, but his tongue felt sewn. Anne moved closer. "You made me a queen, so you could unmake me," she said, voice like wind through teeth. "Your name was the last thing I prayed. Did you know that he didn't?" She knelt beside him. Then, though she had no knees, and laid her weightless palm on his cheek. "I told you Henry was never God," she murmured. When he blinked again, she was gone. But the stone beneath him was slick, warm, pulsing like muscle. He screamed, but the noise stayed inside. Another night, or hour, brought more. Thomas More. The man who had resisted Cromwell's laws with a smile. The man whose head he had watched part from his body in grim silence. He appeared sitting in the corner, legs crossed as if holding court. He held a Bible half-burned with its pages fluttering from wind that wasn't there. "You're sweating, Sin," Thomas More said. Cromwell snarled, or tried to. "You were a fanatic. I gave England the truth. You gave it new masters," More said. Different collar, same leash. Cromwell rose, or believed he did, and staggered toward him. More stood, looked at him with pity, not anger. "You built a kingdom of silence," he said. "Now you see how it ends." He faded piece by piece, until only the Bible remained. Then that too curled into black ash. Cromwell collapsed onto the bench, trembling. The fever deepened. He saw his son next. Gregory stood in the far corner of the room, facing the wall. Gregory Cromwell rasped, sitting up. The boy didn't move. "My son," he called again. "Forgive me." Gregory turned, but where his eyes should have been, there was only stitching. Black twine crossing like a lattice over hollow sockets. His mouth moved, but no sound came. Cromwell screamed, lurched toward him, fell. When he awoke, his head was bleeding. The corner of the cot had split the skin above his brow. Blood seeped into his eyelids, stinging like sand. He laughed. There was still blood in him, enough at least to leave a mark. The next day, or maybe the next hour, a priest came again. A different one. Older. Mute. He sat beside Cromwell and offered no sermon. Just company. The silence was a comfort. Cromwell said aloud, "Do you see them too?" The priest tilted his head. The ghosts. Still nothing. Cromwell reached toward him, grasped the sleeve of his robe. It felt solid. It did not vanish. "I see everything," now Cromwell said. "Everything I built, and why it must fall." The priest nodded finally. Cromwell let go. Sleep returned, but now it was restless. He dreamed of hands dozens clawing up from the Thames, all the monks he'd displaced, all the nuns he'd forced into silence. They did not shout. They pulled. He dreamt of a sword that grew from his stomach, fed on his bowels, and broke through his chest in bloom. A rose made of iron. He dreamed of a throne with no one on it, only a mirror behind it. He walked to the throne, looked into the mirror, and saw not himself, but the tower. Always the tower, always the walls throbbing. When he woke again, The cell was silent. No ghosts, no light, just the sound of something wet dragging across the stones. He sat up, but nothing was there, only the nail on the bench again, rustier now, bent further. It reminded him of his spine. The priest arrived at dusk. He carried no book, wore no cross. His robes were gray, unadorned. No scent of myrrh or sanctity, just the damp smell of a man who had passed through too many locked doors and looked into too many dying eyes. Thomas Cromwell did not rise. The guards didn't speak. One placed a tin cup of water beside the cot. The other handed the priest a parchment scroll, unrolled it with care, then backed out. The scroll bore no words, only a blotch at the center where ink had bled and dried like a wound. The priest set it aside. Cromwell coughed once wet loose, rising from the lungs' basement. Blood came with it. He wiped it away with the sleeve of his execution robe. The gray linen drank it without resistance. "I have nothing to confess," he said. The priest nodded slowly, as if that was the only truth that mattered. "Nothing," Cromwell repeated. "Everything I did in service, in fear, in clarity." He pressed a hand to his chest, could feel the beat there, weak and off rhythm, like a drum left in rain. "I was never righteous," he whispered. "But I was efficient." The priest remained still. His eyes were small, black, and wet, not like eyes at all, more like pits. Cromwell leaned forward. The smell of his own body rose up to meet him. Meat, urine, iron. He looked the priest dead in the face. Did I deserve worse? No answer. Was there ever a world where I lived longer? Still nothing. He reached out, then slowly, and touched the man's hand. Cold. He pulled back. Something small skittered near the door. A rat. Fat, bold. It dragged a string of something wheat hair, a bit of linen. It paused, looked at him, blinked. "You'll feast well tomorrow," Cromwell said. The priest turned his head slightly. That was all. Cromwell slumped back against the wall. For a long time, neither man moved. Then Cromwell spoke again. "Gregory will survive this. I had them spare him." The priest did not move. "He'll hate me," Cromwell said more to the stones now. "They will teach him shame. He will learn to speak my name only in corners." Another silence. Cromwell stared at the nail again, the same one always watching, always rusting. "I never believed in redemption," he said. The priest opened his mouth then, just a little, as if to taste the air. No words came. Cromwell looked at him sharply. "Say something." The priest blinked. Cromwell's voice cracked. "You don't need to forgive me. Just don't forget me." The priest looked down. A long pause. Then softly he unrolled the scroll and handed Cromwell a quill. It was dry. No ink, no knife to draw blood, no words to write. Just the gesture. Cromwell held the quill, thought of every proclamation he had signed, every death sealed by this motion. He dipped it into the blank of the scroll anyway. Drew a line. Meaningless. Faint. Still it felt like a wound. The priest took it back and rolled the parchment again. Still no words exchanged. He stood, turned to go. Cromwell called out, "Tell the king." The priest stopped. Cromwell's voice dropped. "Tell the king I believed him." That was all. The priest left. The door closed with a soft clack. Final. Night came fully then. Cromwell lay flat on the stone. No blanket, no warmth. The iron ring above him no longer dripped, dry now like a socket drained of tears. His mouth opened once more, to God perhaps. But the prayer did not come, only breath, short, halting, like an animal trying not to die. The rats crept closer. One sniffed his foot, another clambered onto the bench. He did not move. He was not afraid. He thought absurdly of pears, his mother's hands cutting them, soft flesh, Sweet rot. He closed his eyes, and in the darkness he saw himself at court, young rising. Henry's hand on his shoulder. The words he would never hear again. We are one mind. No final absolution. No signature on the scroll. No candle lit. Just sleep. And somewhere in the dark, the sound of the headsman sharpening his blade against stone. The morning smelled of sawdust and bile. A fine mist hung over Tower Green, softening the outlines of the waiting crowd, but not their hunger. People stood packed together like fruit in a barrel, stiff with anticipation, robed in silence. Some wore hoods, others squinted against the brightness. All had come to witness a man unmade. The scaffold was simple. No drapery, no banners. Just timber raw and practical, stained in places too deep to clean. It had been used yesterday. It would be used tomorrow. Today it would devour Thomas Cromwell. They led him out at sunrise, 4 guards flanking one ahead. His legs trembled beneath the execution robe. Each step felt like a betrayal of gravity. The world had turned sharp. The light hurt his eyes. The morning's hush was pierced only by a single gull, crying overhead as if mocking the pretense of reverence. Cromwell's mouth was dry, tongue thick. He had not spoken since the priest left, had not eaten, had not slept, only breathed shallow and purposeful like a man trying to stay alive by increments. The crowd parted as he approached the scaffold. There were murmurs, small trembling words. Someone spat. Another crossed herself. He caught one boy's eyes. The child's expression wasn't hatred or pity. It was curiosity. The wide, unblinking gaze of someone seeing the truth of the state for the first time. The scaffold reeked. Old blood, sour wood, the faint trace of excrement. His boots stuck slightly as he mounted the steps. The platform tilted under his weight like a breath being held. The headsman stood ready broad, thick-fingered, silent. His axe glinted only dully, no poetry in its edge. Not a sword, not a relic. Just a tool. The edge had already claimed a dozen this year, perhaps more. It did not shine. It did not sing. It simply waited. Sir William Kingston stepped forward, eyes averted. His voice cracked. "My lord, the king has granted a swift death. He asks that you speak, if you will." Cromwell turned toward the crowd. His knees buckled slightly, but he stayed standing. He looked out across the gathered faces, priests, merchants, boys, soldiers, courtiers. Some had called him tyrant, others savior. Most nothing at all. His lips parted. No sound came. Then after a breath a whisper emerged. "I die in the king's mercy. Long live the king." It was the required script. Nothing more. But then something new. Cromwell raised his eyes not to the sky, not to the crowd, but directly at the headsman. "I built this world from paper and blood," he said. "Now let it take me back." No one spoke. Even the birds quieted. He knelt. The block was cold, smelled of oil and iron. He rested his chin in the groove. The crowd inhaled as one. Cromwell's eyes remained open. Above him the axe was lifted. The headsman did not hesitate. The first strike landed slightly off, caught the back of the skull, not the neck. A spray of blood. A gasp. Cromwell twitched fingers clawing into the wood. A moan not his own rose from the crowd. The second stroke hit true. His body jerked, then slumped. The third unnecessary ended the twitching. The head rolled once. Eyes still open. Jaw slightly parted. They said later his mouth moved again, that his eyes blinked, that the soul lingered for a breath watching its audience. The priest stepped forward, muttered something that didn't reach the wind. A boy vomited. The headsman wiped the axe on Cromwell's robe. No bell was tolled. No herald cried his death. The crowd began to disperse as quickly as it had gathered. No relics taken. No prayers offered. By noon, only the blood remained. Back in his cell, the nail in the bench was gone. pulled from the wood and discarded. The guards scrubbed the walls. A new prisoner would arrive tomorrow. All signs of Cromwell, his voice, his papers, his scent, were purged. But in the floor's cracks, his blood lingered. A few drops turned black. By evening, even they had dried. The parchment curled in flame. One by one, the ledgers bearing his seal were fed to fire. Monastic inventories, treaties, brokered orders of execution, even the king's letters, many written in affection, some in rage, all blackened to ash. The Privy Council oversaw the purge with the efficiency Cromwell himself had taught them. Holbein's portrait was taken down from the great chamber at Austin Friars. The thick brushwork of his face, those heavy-lidded eyes, the crushing weight of thought behind them, had unsettled too many noblemen. It was not burned, not at first. It was stored somewhere in the royal vaults, left to mildew in quiet disgrace. Later it was lost. His family's coat of arms was scratched from the windows of his home, chiseled off fountains scraped from silver tankards. His son Gregory, spared by mercy or guilt, was granted a reduced inheritance, and strict instructions to speak not of the father's fall. He obeyed. Mostly. The books Cromwell had collected, ancient law, banned scripture, forbidden commentary, were divided between loyal peers and suspicious bishops. Some volumes reappeared years later in the libraries of men who had once spat at his name. But in the Tower, the cell that had held him was scrubbed, emptied, renamed. And yet, the stone remembered, there were rumors. The next prisoner in Cromwell's chamber, a petty baron accused of smuggling, refused to sleep near the bench. Claimed it pulsed at night. Said he heard quills scratching from within the wall, as if documents were still being drawn in blood. Said a voice whispered Latin confessions through the drip of water. Domine non sum dignus. They transferred him within a week. Years later, the scaffold boards were replaced, but the blood beneath the wood remained. Rain washed most of it away. But once a year, on the date of Cromwell's death, the grain turned dark again, just for a morning. A superstition grew, don't step there. Even executioners avoided it. He was not canonized, nor vilified in song. He vanished not with a roar, but with a surgical excision. History twisted around his absence. But the empire he built endured. The English Bible in every parish that was him. The broken monasteries, their stones now part of noble estates, that was him. The king as head of the church, that too was him, and so was the fear. The knowledge that one man, unroyal by birth, could rise high enough to unmake heaven's order, only to be flayed from memory at a king's whim, became a warning etched into every servant's breath, every scribe's ink, every cautious word uttered in Parliament for generations. They said Henry never spoke of him again, but one story survived barely. That in his final days, obese and sore-ridden, the king awoke, screaming from a dream. His guards rushed in to find him clawing at his chest. He stood over me, Henry rasped, wearing my crown of iron, smiling. He ordered more prayers, more candles, and more silence. No monument marks Cromwell's grave. No known site bears his body. It may rest beneath the tower's soil or in some shallow pit behind the scaffold gnawed at by rats who learned his name before the worms did. But his ghost is not in the earth. It walks Westminster. In every law passed with closed doors, in every sentence uttered in Parliament without dissent, in every public death where mercy wears an official seal, all power crumbles at the edge of the grave. But the idea of power that lingers, that seeps, and the man who understood that better than anyone, they burned his letters, they silenced his name, but they could not bury the blueprint.